Hello, and welcome to Nobody Talks Games. As the name of this channel implies, I'm nobody important. No one at all. Just a guy talking about video game topics that I find interesting. As you can see, today's topic is Hollow Knight Silksong. And specifically, we are answering the question that everyone seems to be asking right now. Is Silksong too hard? For context, it took me about 50 hours to 100% the entire game. The footage you are seeing is early gameplay I recorded of myself playing the game for the first time. Let's start with a comparison between Silksong and Team Cherry's first game, Hollow Knight. Yes, Silksong's base game is absolutely more difficult than Hollow Knight's base game. We still don't know if Team Cherry will add DLC to Silksong, but even if we include Hollow Knight's DLC, I'd say Silksong is as hard as most of the Pantheon sections, excluding, of course, Pantheon 5 and probably Pantheon 4. But let's get into some specifics, starting with combat. Sticking with the comparison of the two games for now, I think Hollow Knight has slightly more simple combat in general, and more consistent upgrades to make yourself, or the knight, more powerful early on. In general, spells in Hollow Knight, especially Descending Dark, are more powerful than the tools in Silksong, and you don't need material to use spells. In Silksong, tools require materials to craft, and while they are abundant and it's not really a big deal in the first part of the game, as the game gets more difficult in the second half, I eventually ran out of materials a couple times on certain difficult bosses. At the end of the day, this is just an inconvenience, but it adds to the fact that spells are definitely more powerful than tools. Silksong provides more diverse combat with the inclusion of crests, and if you want an experience more similar to Hollow Knight, you can use the Wanderer's Crest. I personally stuck with the Hunter's Crest, which is the first one you start out with, because I found it fun and didn't want to use a similar moveset to Hollow Knight. As an aside, feel free to comment which is your favorite crest to use. Moving on to bosses and rooms with enemy waves. Silksong definitely has harder bosses overall, and it seems that the bosses have more health, or at least Hornet deals less damage for most of the game. This was my experience. It's hard to know for sure though. In particular, there are way more rooms filled with enemy waves that Hornet needs to defeat back to back. There are even bosses with enemy waves to start, and then you need to beat the boss after dealing with all the enemy waves. Again, these are generally more difficult than in Hollow Knight, and occur way more frequently than in Hollow Knight. This is just one reason why Hollow Knight's bosses and the combat in general is definitely easier than in Silksong. Next, we'll talk about runbacks. This is something that has been brought up a lot regarding if Silksong is too hard. For a little context, a runback is basically the distance from a boss to the nearest respawn point. So longer runbacks are when it takes a minute, 2 minutes, or even longer to run back to a boss after dying and respawning at a bench. Hollow Knight, again the original, has very few runbacks in it. It has some for sure, but in general you can get back to a boss pretty quickly, and a lot of times you don't even need to encounter any enemies. In Silksong, it's the opposite. Almost every boss has a runback, and a lot of the harder bosses, or maybe just like the main story bosses, have runbacks where you need to do difficult platforming and there are enemies blocking your way. I personally had an interesting experience with how my feelings around runbacks in Silksong developed. At the start of the game, I was very surprised by them, again especially because Hollow Knight really doesn't have very many runbacks at all. So when I started seeing a lot of runbacks in Silksong, it definitely took me aback a little bit. However, I soon realized that for the lore of Silksong, having runbacks actually makes sense. For instance, the whole part of the first act of Silksong is you're trying to get to the Citadel. You're doing this pilgrimage that all these other little bugs that, you know, are religious and believe in this religion to get to the Citadel to kind of reach enlightenment, or it's kind of almost like their heaven. Their goal is to make this pilgrimage to do that. But as Hornet, you soon realize that the Citadel doesn't want you to make it. Therefore, once I thought about it in that context, it makes sense that the benches, again, the benches that you often have to pay for, it makes sense that they are far away from bosses, because whatever whatever bugs or people are up in the Citadel are trying to make it as difficult as possible for these other bugs to make the pilgrimage. They're trying to make all the other bugs die, and they don't want them to reach the Citadel. Now, this might sound silly, but there are other examples where the lore can kind of dictate how long a runback is. A really popular example is in Elden Ring. When you get to Raya Lucaria, there is a very long run back to the boss, Renala, in Raya Lucaria. And one reason why that might be so is because there are no statues of Marika in Raya Lucaria. And a statue of Marika is basically an additional respawn point. But there are no statues in Raya Lucaria because Renala destroyed all of them. Because Marika basically stole Renala's husband. So, you know, out of pettiness, she destroyed all the statues of Marika within Raya Lucaria, therefore making it more difficult for the player to get back to her boss arena, because you need to start at the nearest Grace instead of starting at a statue of Marika. Yes, again, this is still silly, especially considering Marika is actually Radagon, and it's a whole weird thing. But let's forget about that. We're not talking about Elden Ring today, okay? Anyway, back to Silksong. This is why I was like, okay, having long runbacks in the first act makes sense. And then once I got to Act 2, I was like, okay, sure. They still want it to be difficult within the Citadel because there's more secrets to uncover, so some runbacks in the Citadel make sense as well. It was when I really started branching out and finding all the secret optional areas in Silksong that I realized that almost all these optional areas have some of the most difficult runbacks. And then I started thinking, this doesn't really make as much sense lore-wise anymore. I mean, you could argue that it still does because they just want it to be as difficult as possible, you know, to get these pilgrims to die no matter what instead of making it to the Citadel. But I started to kind of realize that, okay, maybe this is just Team Cherry and the developers just wanting difficult runbacks and runbacks with lots of platforming and enemies getting in your way. Related to this, we're going to move on to the currency in Silksong, which are rosary beads. In Silksong, rosary beads are the currency that Hornet uses to buy things. They're used for a lot of different things in Silksong. Most notably, you need to spend beads to open, I would say, like 80 to 90% of the benches in the entire game. Now, this is very different from Hollow Knight. In Hollow Knight, I would say it's like the opposite statistic. I would say maybe only about like 10 to 20% of benches in Hollow Knight need to be opened using Geo, the currency in Hollow Knight. And again, in Silksong, it's the opposite. You need beads to open 80 to 90% of all benches. That means you spend a lot of beads just opening benches, and you have a lot less money then to actually buy items from merchants and things like that. Again, lore-wise, this makes perfect sense. It's just like any church when they start passing around the basket and you give money. The Citadel wants all of the pilgrims' money. They want all of their rosary beads. So, by making the benches only open when you insert a certain amount of rosary beads, the Citadel gets more and more and more money. That's why I personally don't find the bead situation that frustrating because, again, lore-wise, I think it's pretty cool and it definitely makes sense. But yes, when compared to Hollow Knight, the currency situation in Silksong is more difficult because you need to spend a lot of the beads on benches, and there are way more merchants to buy items from. So you're going to end up needing more money overall. Alright, we are getting to the end of this video. To wrap things up, yes, Silksong will be a difficult game for most people to play, and it is very likely it will be a harder game to beat than Hollow Knight. With that in mind, let's answer the question, is Silksong too hard? Short answer, no. The game is as hard as Team Cherry wants it to be, and I personally am totally fine with that. Not every game needs to be for every gamer. With that being said, I personally am all for accessibility options and difficulty options. I prefer playing games on standard difficulty in general, but if Team Cherry ever added easier difficulty modes, it wouldn't upset me. I would simply play the game on the standard difficulty. If From Software ever added difficulty modes, it wouldn't upset me either. But again, I would personally play on the standard difficulty mode. A great example is the game Lies of P, which many think is the best Souls-like game out there, myself included. They added difficulty options when they released their DLC earlier this year. I personally still play on the standard difficulty, which is the original difficulty, but I'm happy for people that can experience the game now on easier modes. Again though, it'd be fine if difficulty modes weren't added. It's simply up to the developer, and yes, maybe the developer would make more money if they had difficulty options, since more people could play it, but again, that's a choice each developer needs to make. To sum things up, Team Cherry has made a difficult game called Hollow Knight Silksong. I personally don't think the game is too hard, and I enjoy the challenge. Team Cherry has already made the game slightly easier, and may continue to do so with updates. That's also completely up to them. I think the game is incredible, and I had an amazing experience with it overall. Please let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments. Again, I'm Nobody Important, and this has been Nobody Talks Games. Thank you so much for listening or watching. Lastly, if you disagree with anything I said, that's great. Feel free to tell me, but just know, nobody cares.